Welcome to the Angel's Message for You original channel. This is our only official channel. Please beware of copycat and pirated channels, and stay connected to the original source for authentic angel messages and true blessings. Before you read even one more word, I want you to just pause for a second. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let whatever tension you've been carrying today just soften a little. Because the angels are right here with you in this moment, wrapping you in a warm golden light that you may not be able to see with your physical eyes, but that you can absolutely feel in your heart if you allow yourself to. This blessing has been prepared with so much love and so much care, specifically for you, for exactly where you are in your life right now. And if you stay with this message all the way to the very end, something inside of you is going to shift in a way that will genuinely surprise you. So please keep reading. Don't skip ahead. Don't rush through. Every single word in this message has a reason for being here. And what's waiting for you at the end is something your soul has been longing to hear for a very long time. Stay with it. You showed up here for a reason, and that reason is about to reveal itself. You didn't find your way here by accident. That's the first thing the angels want you to understand. There are no accidents when it comes to divine guidance. Not a single one. Every small decision you made today, every click, every pause, every quiet, restless moment that eventually led you to this exact message, all of it was guided and gently directed by a loving, intelligent presence that has been watching over you since the very day you took your first breath in this world. Your guardian angels have been waiting with the most beautiful patience for this specific moment, for a time when your heart would be open enough and still enough and ready enough to receive what they have been burning to tell you. And right now, in this very moment, they are delivering that message as clearly and as powerfully as they possibly can. So open up. Let it in. You are safe here. You are loved. You are seen. Something extraordinary is already on its way to you. Let that land. Not just as pleasant words on a screen that you briefly notice and then scroll past. Let those three truths land in your body like something solid, something you can hold on to. Because the angels are not speaking to your mind right now. They are speaking directly to your soul. And your soul already knows that what they're saying is true, even if your mind has been arguing with it for a long time. You are loved, not conditionally, not when you get it together, not after you've healed enough or changed enough or figured enough out. You are loved right now completely as you are. You are seen, not the version of you that you show the world, but the real you, the tender, complicated, beautifully human you that lives underneath all the roles you play and all the faces you wear. And something beautiful, something that your heart has been quietly hoping for through every season of your life, is already in motion, already on its way, already moving toward you with a certainty that the universe itself is guaranteeing. There is someone out there. Someone real and present and alive in this world right now. Someone going about their ordinary days, making their coffee in the morning, driving their familiar roads, doing the 1,000 small things that fill up a human life. And yet, underneath all of that ordinary routine, there is something happening in them that they can't quite put words to. A pull, a longing, a quiet and persistent sense that something is missing, that someone is missing, that there is a shape of a person-sized space in their life that has not yet been filled. They don't know your face yet. They may not know your name. They couldn't pick you out of a crowd. But on the level that actually matters, the level that exists beneath names and faces and the entire surface of ordinary everyday life, their soul knows you. It knows you in the way that the ocean knows the shore even when they are separated by miles of water. It knows you, and it is reaching toward you right now even as you sit here reading this. In the quiet moments of their life, Maybe in that soft space right before sleep when the busyness of the day finally releases its grip and everything gets still. Maybe in the early morning when light is just beginning to come through the window and the world feels wide open and full of something they can't name. Maybe in the middle of an ordinary moment when a song comes on the radio or the breeze moves in just a certain way or something beautiful catches their eye and suddenly they feel this wave of longing, of readiness, of something that feels like anticipation without a known cause. In those moments, they feel you, not consciously, not in a way they could explain to someone else, but they feel the pull of you. They are being drawn toward you the same way you have sometimes felt drawn toward something you couldn't quite see yet, but somehow, in the deepest part of yourself, knew with complete certainty was coming. This is the message they would send you right now if they could reach through whatever distance separates you and speak directly to your heart. I see you, not the you that the world gets, not the version of you that knows how to seem fine, that knows how to keep it together, that knows how to smile at the right moments and say the right things and make everything look manageable even on the days when manageable is the last thing it feels. I see the real you, the one who feels things so deeply that sometimes it's almost too much. The one who loves people so fully and so freely, even when love has cost you something. The one who carries such a genuine kindness inside you that it just spills out naturally into everything you do, into the small things that nobody else even thinks to notice. I see the courage it takes for you to keep your heart open when you have had plenty of reasons over the years to close it down and protect yourself. I see the hope you have tended inside yourself through every difficult season, the hope you sometimes wondered if you were foolish to keep holding. I see every prayer you've sent up in the dark, every night you fell asleep wondering, every morning you woke up and decided, quietly and without fanfare, to keep believing. I see all of that, every single piece of it, and not one part of it makes me love you less. Every single part of it makes me love you more than you can currently imagine. I know the waiting hasn't been easy. I need you to know that I know that. I know there have been stretches of time, maybe long ones, when the loneliness settled in so quietly and so completely that you stopped noticing where it ended and where you began. I know there have been heartbreaks, the sharp, sudden kind and the slow, grinding kind, and that some of those wounds are still tender in ways you don't always talk about because you've gotten so good at carrying things on your own. I know you've had moments when doubt sat down next to you and stayed for a while, whispering its unkind questions about whether the love you're hoping for is really real, whether it's really out there, whether maybe you're just one of those people who isn't meant to have it. I know that fear. I know how heavy it gets, and I want you to hear me clearly and completely when I say this. I am coming. I am not a dream. I am not wishful thinking. I am not something that only happens to other people while somehow passing you by. I am a real person, alive in this world right now, walking my own path, learning my own lessons, being shaped by my own experiences into someone who will be able to love you in the specific way that you need to be loved. And I am being guided toward you, not randomly, not by coincidence, but with a precision and an intention that goes far beyond what either of us can fully see or understand from where we're standing. Every step I take, even the ones that look like they have nothing to do with you, even the ones that seem random or small or just the ordinary movements of an ordinary life, every step is bringing me closer to the moment when I will find you. The same invisible hand that guided you to this message is the very same hand that is weaving our stories together, thread by thread, day by day, with a patience and a skill that takes the breath away when you catch even a glimpse of it. The angels want you to let go of something right now. They've been watching you carry it, and they want to help you set it down. It's the belief that love is something you have to chase, that it's something you have to convince into existence or prove yourself worthy of or work hard enough to deserve. That if you just do the right things and say the right things and become the right version of yourself, then maybe finally love will decide you're enough. The angels want you to hear this with everything you have. That belief is not true. It has never been true. It is one of the most damaging stories that gets told in this world, and it has caused so much unnecessary pain to so many beautiful people who were always already enough. Love, real love, the deep and lasting and soul-level kind, is not a reward you earn. It is a gift you are given, and it is already being prepared for you. It is already in motion. It is already alive and real and moving through the world, being carried by someone whose heart is already, in the most profound and unseen way, attuned to yours. You don't have to earn this. You don't have to become more or be more or fix yourself into something different. You just have to stay open. You just have to keep trusting. That is the one and only thing being asked of you right now. The angels also want to speak directly to something else they've seen weighing on you. The question of timing, the deep and sometimes aching wonder of when. You've tried not to obsess over it. You've told yourself to be patient, to trust the process, to let go of the timeline. And you've done a beautiful job. But underneath all of that, the question still lives in you. When? And the angels want to answer it as honestly and as lovingly as they can. They can't give you a date. Not because they don't know, but because the knowing is not what you need. What you need is something better than a date. What you need is certainty. And they are giving you that certainty right now. This love is coming. It is coming as surely as the sun rises, as surely as the seasons turn, as surely as any law of nature that you have never once had to question or doubt. It is coming. And it is coming at the exact right time, the time that will make the most sense for both of you, not just one of you, both of you. Because here is what the angels can see from where they stand that you can't quite see from where you're standing. There is a precision to this. There is a reason for every single day of the waiting, not just in your life, but in theirs. There are things your person is going through right now, things they needed to experience, lessons they needed to learn, versions of themselves they needed to grow through and leave behind. And those experiences are not just happening to them. They are making them into the person who will be able to love you well. Every hard thing they've walked through has been adding depth to them, wisdom to them, tenderness and understanding and capacity. Every old wound they've been healing has made their heart bigger and more ready for the love they will bring to you. They are becoming, right now, through everything their life is putting them through, exactly the person you need. And the universe will not send them to you before that process is complete, because the universe loves you too much to give you something that isn't fully ready for you. Pause for a moment. Before we continue, your angels are asking me to pause for a moment. Not everyone was meant to hear this today, but if these words found you, there may be a reason. If you've been seeing repeated signs, feeling disconnected from the life you're living, or sensing that something bigger is trying to unfold for you, this message may be arriving at exactly the right time. Your angels want you to understand something. Sometimes blessings don't arrive by changing what's around you. They arrive by changing the reality you're aligned with. Many people spend years praying for abundance, love, protection, and breakthroughs while unknowingly remaining connected to the same old patterns, fears, and limitations. But today, your angels are reminding you that a different path may already be available to you. A path where you feel more aligned with your purpose. A path where opportunities seem to find you. A path where your manifestations begin flowing with greater ease. This isn't about forcing outcomes. It's about becoming energetically available for the blessings that have been trying to reach you. I truly believe some of you were guided to this message because you felt stuck for far too long. You've prayed. You've waited. You've asked for a sign. And perhaps this moment is one of those signs. The universe often opens doors quietly before it opens them widely. What looks like a simple opportunity today can become the very thing that shifts your direction tomorrow. Divine timing rarely feels accidental. And if your heart feels pulled toward this, pay attention to that feeling. If this resonates with your spirit, take a moment to explore the resource we've placed in the description and pinned comment below. Don't ignore the nudge if you feel one. Sometimes receiving a blessing begins with taking a small step when the door first appears. The information is waiting for you in the description and pinned comment. Now continue with your angel message. The same is true in reverse. Everything you are going through right now is making you more ready too. More open, more whole, more clear about what you truly need and what you are no longer willing to settle for. More capable of receiving love without immediately trying to manage it or control it or wonder when it's going to disappear. Your experiences are not a detour from your story. They are your story, and they are a beautiful one, even the parts that have been painful, because every part of it has been growing you toward the love that is coming. Not metaphorically, actually, really, truly growing you toward it in the most precise and intentional way. In their dreams, in the soft space between sleeping and waking where the soul moves freely and the guards come down, they are already dreaming of a love like the one you will share. They are imagining what it would feel like to be truly known, to be chosen not in spite of who they are but because of it, to have a partner who walks beside them through the messy and the magnificent, who laughs with them over the small things and holds them through the hard ones. They don't know yet that they're dreaming of you. They couldn't tell you your name or describe your face. But somewhere in those dreams, in that soul-level longing they feel when they wake up and the dream is already fading, you are there. The feeling of you is there. The shape of the love you will share is there. And it is calling to them the same way it is calling to you. They are already searching for you. Not frantically, not desperately, but in the quiet, faithful way that the soul moves toward what it needs. The way a compass needle swings north without being told which direction that is. There is an intelligence working in both of you that goes deeper than anything your conscious mind can plan or direct. And that intelligence is trustworthy. It has been moving you both along the right paths even when those paths felt confusing or winding or much too long. It knows where it's going. It knows what it's doing. And it is taking you, both of you, exactly where you need to be. When you finally find each other, and there will be something immediately different about it. Different from the false starts and the almost loves and the connections that seemed so promising before they slowly revealed themselves not to be quite right. This will have a quality that those others didn't. Clarity, a peace, something that settles into your chest like a breath you didn't know you were holding finally releasing. There won't be the usual second-guessing, the exhausting analysis of texts and signals and whether they really mean what they seem to mean. There will be an ease to it, a naturalness, as though you are simply recognizing something you already knew. Because you will be, on the soul level, you will be recognizing someone you have always known. And that recognition will feel like the most wonderful thing you have ever felt, because it will feel like coming home. The love you are going to share will go so much deeper than surface romance. Though it will absolutely be filled with romance, with warmth and closeness and all the beautiful tenderness of two people who have genuinely chosen each other. But underneath all of that, there will be a foundation of real partnership, of being truly known and truly chosen and truly loved. Not the parts of you that are easy to love, but all of you, the complicated parts, the tender parts, the growing parts, the parts you've been the most afraid to show. This person will not need you to be different. They will not need you to perform or pretend or maintain some version of yourself that requires constant effort to keep up. They will want the real you. They will love the real you. And in the love they offer, Some things inside you that have been braced for a very long time will finally be able to soften and rest. This love will carry healing in it. Not the painful tearing open kind of healing, but the gentle, quiet, almost imperceptible kind that happens when you feel truly safe for the first time. When you don't have to be on guard. When you can put down the weight you've been carrying and someone else is there to help carry it, and suddenly it's not quite so heavy. This kind of healing is real. It is one of the most powerful forces available to a human being. And it is coming for you, wrapped up in this love, offered freely by someone whose heart has been prepared to give it. The angels want to address something directly because they can see it's been sitting in the back of your mind even as you've been trying to push it away. The fear that maybe you've already missed it, that maybe love came close once or twice and slipped away and that was your chance and now it's gone. That maybe the waiting has been so long that something must be wrong. That maybe you're just not the kind of person who gets to have this. The angels want to look you in the eyes, metaphorically, with all the warmth and authority they carry, and tell you plainly, none of that is true. Not one word of it. Those thoughts are not truth. They are old pain pretending to be truth. They are the voice of past hurt that has been mistaken for wisdom. And it's time to stop listening to them, not because you should just think positive, but because they are factually, genuinely, completely wrong. Take a quick second before we move forward. Many channels are reposting and copying our content, but authentic energy cannot be duplicated. For the strongest positive connection and divine guidance, always listen from the original Angel's Message for You channel with the black logo base. Now, let's continue with the message your angels want you to hear. You have not missed anything that was meant for you. The universe does not operate that way. It does not lay out your destiny and then snatch it away because you weren't in the right place at the right time. Every connection that didn't work out was not your destiny slipping through your fingers. It was the process of refinement. It was life helping you to understand more clearly what you truly need, what you cannot compromise on, what real love actually feels like as opposed to what almost love feels like. It was preparation. All of it, every single bit of it was preparation. And the preparation is working. You are more ready than you know. You are more whole than you feel on your hardest days. And your person, your real person, the one the universe has been shaping alongside you this whole time, is coming. The angels are asking you to do something as you receive this message. They are asking you to make a choice. Not a dramatic, everything changes overnight kind of choice. Just a quiet, internal, this is what I am going to believe kind of choice. They are asking you to choose trust over fear. Not because trust is easier, it isn't always. Not because there's no part of you that's scared. There may be a very loud part of you that's scared. But because trust is truer. Because on the level of soul, on the level where the angels live and where the real workings of the universe take place, everything is already in motion. Everything is already unfolding. The love you have been hoping for is not a question mark. It is a certainty. And the angels are asking you to let that certainty be the ground you stand on. Keep your heart open. This is perhaps the most important practical thing they're asking of you. Keep your heart open, not naively, not in a way that ignores your own wisdom or throws away the discernment you've gained through experience, but open, soft, willing to believe that the next chapter of your story is going to be different from the chapters that have hurt you. Willing to receive love when it comes, not with suspicion or bracing or awaiting for the other shoe to drop energy, but with genuine openness. Because the love that is coming for you deserves to be received that way. And so do you. While you wait, the angels want you to remember something that is easy to forget. Your life right now, this present life you are living, This is not just the waiting room before the real thing starts. This is your life, and it is worth living fully. The love that is coming will enter a life that is already being lived, not a life that has been on hold. So invest in yourself. Pursue the things that light you up. Build the friendships that nourish you. Do the work that gives you a sense of purpose and meaning. Travel if you want to travel. Learn what you've been curious about. Create the life that makes you feel most like yourself. Because all of that is not just passing time. All of that is becoming more you. And the more fully you become yourself, the more magnetic you are to the love that is looking for exactly you. Your person is out there doing the same thing. Growing, living, becoming, getting more ready with every passing day. And the two of you in your separate lives are moving toward each other with the kind of momentum that only builds over time. The universe has been building this for longer than you know. And when the moment comes, when your paths finally intersect in whatever ordinary or extraordinary way they are meant to, you will both feel the weight of all that preparation. You will both feel the sense of something clicking into place that was always supposed to be there. And it will be, without any exaggeration at all, one of the most beautiful moments of your entire life. The angels are with you in every single step between now and that moment. In the easy days and the hard ones. In the confident days when you feel completely sure that everything is working out, and in the harder days when doubt creeps back in and tries to take up residence again. In the quiet, ordinary moments, and in the moments when everything feels uncertain and you just need to know that someone is there. They are there. They are always there. Working on your behalf with a love and a dedication and a consistency that never wavers. Clearing paths, moving obstacles, holding the thread of your story with the most careful and loving hands, and whispering to you, even in the moments when you can't quite hear it, that you are not alone, that you are loved, that what you've been hoping for is real, and that it is coming. The love that is meant for you is already dreaming of you. It is already feeling the pull of you. It is already, in the most unseen and real ways, on its way. And when it arrives, when it finally stands in front of you and you look at it and it looks at you, everything will make sense. Every hard season, every moment of doubt, every prayer you sent up and every night you went to sleep still hoping, all of it will suddenly have a shape and a meaning that you couldn't see before. And you will feel with your whole entire self that it was worth it, that you were worth it, that the love you now hold in your hands was worth every single moment of the journey that brought you here. Trust the journey, beautiful soul. Trust the angels who are walking every step of it right beside you. Trust the deep and unshakable truth that has been true about you from the very beginning, that you are worthy of love, that you are deserving of joy, that you are seen and held and guided by forces that love you completely. And trust that the best, the absolute most beautiful best, is not behind you. It is ahead of you. It is coming. And it is going to be everything you hoped for and so much more than you thought to ask for. The angels love you. They are with you. And they are saying, with every bit of the certainty they carry, that your love story is not over. It has not even reached its most beautiful chapter yet. That chapter is being written right now, in the unseen places where miracles are made. And it is going to take your breath away. End of text. And because the angels know how the human heart works, they want to leave you with one final, deeply important reminder before you close this message and go back to your day. The love that is coming is not something you need to force, rush, or manufacture. You don't need to search harder or try differently or wonder if you're doing something wrong. You are not doing anything wrong. You have never been doing anything wrong. The love that is meant for you has your name written on it, and it cannot be given to someone else. It is yours. It has always been yours. And nothing you do or don't do can take it away from you, because it is not based on your performance. It is based on something far deeper and far more permanent than that. It is based on who you are at the level of soul. And at that level, you are extraordinary. You are exactly right. You are everything that your person has been hoping for without fully knowing it yet. So go gently. Go with hope. Go with the quiet, steady confidence of someone who knows, not just believes but knows, that they are loved and guided and that the most beautiful things in their story are still ahead of them. Let the angels hold what you cannot hold on your own. Let them carry the worry and the wondering and the weight of the unknown. That is what they are here for. And let yourself simply be here, in this life, in this moment, open and ready and trusting that the universe has not forgotten you. It never has. It never could. You are too important to the story it is telling to ever be forgotten or overlooked or left behind. Your love is coming. It is real. It is close. And it is going to be, without any doubt at all, absolutely worth the wait. Dear beautiful soul, this angel's message for you channel is a divine space, a sanctuary for the soul. If you're new to this channel, think of this as your spiritual home. It's a sacred space created intentionally for faith to grow, purpose to be sparked, and God-given destinies to be confirmed and lived out. We are busy building a lively community deeply rooted in the rich soil of God's unconditional love, a place where heaven truly speaks into our lives and deep, lasting change regularly happens. We warmly invite you to subscribe and stay connected, because God undoubtedly has so much more to reveal and bring about in your unique life journey. You genuinely don't want to miss what the divine is preparing to do next in and through you. Consider making a generous contribution if you feel moved to support our efforts of spreading divine messages. Whether it's $5, $10, $20, or $50, your contribution enables us to continue sharing these profound messages of healing and hope with the world. Spreading the word is just the beginning of our mission. Hearts are being healed, hope is being renewed, and souls are being guided back to the light. Your support helps us realize our shared goal of making a positive impact. Your generosity, no matter how small, is what keeps our community thriving and bringing people together in love on this sacred journey. We are all interconnected, and we will rise as one. By uniting, we can conquer this. Let us wholeheartedly embrace the abundance that lies ahead. Amen.